Hello guys, welcome to another video that is going to be both an art topic commentary and a little bit of a tutorial. We're going to be talking about tracing, why it can be a good thing, and when/how to do it. Put an asterisk in that because this is not going to be a video of me being like, tracing everything is okay and the people who ever said tracing is wrong is bad, because it's a touchy subject. We're going to get into it. I'll also be covering the difference between referencing and tracing, so if you are not certain of like which is what, we'll be getting into that a little bit, and we'll talk about how they work hand in hand in some cases for when you want to make your stuff. And of course any other topic that may overlap with both tracing and referencing art or models or photography for your work. The art for this video is going to be moving around a bit as I cover topics, so you guys can have some visuals for what I am talking about. Some are quick studies I did, while others will be some art pieces or sketches I used to make references, and they'll just be plain time lapses in the background, kind of like my previous video. So they're gonna go by a little quicker than my usual speed paints do. As always, I'll have like the art cycle in the back at the end of the video if you guys want to take a closer look at it. And I know I did it for my last video, but I'm not gonna make a habit out of doing these videos in this format, so if it's not something you're super into, don't worry, it's not like a permanent thing with my videos. I just felt like this would be the best way for me to show what I'm talking about. So let me answer the burning question that admittedly clickbaity title of this video leaves you. Do I think people should be allowed to trace art? My answer is yes, but it depends on how and if you are posting the art, why you are tracing it, and if you're claiming it as your own. Listen, there are a lot of jerks who do trace art and claim it as their own original work. I've had that happen with my own art before, and it sucks because I put a lot of time and effort into my art to get to where it is, and for someone to grab my art and trace over it and say they're the ones that created it doesn't feel great. And it sucks worse when you have to be the bad guy and scold someone who's most likely a kid for tracing your art. So why would I say like, well, tracing isn't a bad thing if that's the case? Well, it's because it's how we learned art. I'll admit, when I started off as like a little baby, I mostly traced Pokemon and Garfield art because that's like what I had on hand. And later when I got older, I would heavily reference art I like, and I just would redraw art pieces that I really liked, but with my OCs. I never actually traced like other people's art that wasn't like Pokemon in a Pokemon book or from a Garfield comic, but what I, didn't really understand how the way I was referencing the art was pretty bad, but I was also 13 and I didn't really know any better. And I did end up taking those drawings down after I realized like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. But I wanted to mention that because if you're somebody who's done the same thing or, is a child doing the same thing, it's okay. Maybe don't keep doing it, but it's fine. People on the internet are really mean. But tracing art is how a lot of us learned to draw something when we first started off. But however, how I feel about posting it is this. If you're going to trace someone's art, never post it online and never claim it as your own original work. The only times I think it's like okay to post it is if it's like with photography, mostly if you took the photos you traced or if you give credit to the photo you traced and, like modify it. And however, same with like memes. Like, I'm pretty sure all of us have traced over memes before with our blurbos, and that's like, perfectly fine. It's a meme. Nobody's going to think you made the original one. Unless you did make the original one, then that would be really weird. But I think it's pretty okay if you're like, doing that because it follows a certain format. They're recognizable, and everybody has traced over that like one photo of the lady with like the kids who's like swinging her arms around in an airport. And using your own photos for tracing is better because mostly for monetary reasons, and if you're someone who sells your art. And my own personal doodles of my OCs, like for memes, I don't worry so much about it because it's a meme, so and I don't usually have plans for making money off of it. And it's less of an issue if you're like referencing something, which is essentially like, somebody doesn't know the difference between referencing and tracing. Tracing is like, taking the image and drawing on top of it, versus referencing is looking at the image while you are drawing based off that image. So like that's the difference with the big difference with those two. And referencing can be really good if you're trying to learn anatomy and do poses and stuff, but tracing can also be good in that regard. They're like, Everybody's gotta learn somehow. But like, what does it look like when you're doing like referencing versus tracing? So I'm gonna give like an example of like what I do with stuff that I find hard to draw, and we're gonna talk about cars, specifically like the cars that my characters and my webcomic in Harmony drive. I went out of my way to find out exactly what brand of cars each of these characters would drive, and I went and I made quick, rough references of these cars so the cars are more consistent in later pages, because if you look at my comic, you can clearly see that they're not. But that's because I don't draw a lot of cars. But then I'm like, oh, well, this comic, only 3 chapters, and I've drawn a lot of cars, so maybe I should get better at drawing cars, or maybe I should have a reference for like the cars I'm going to draw a lot. So yeah, I only own one kind of car, and I certainly don't own any of the cars my characters drive. So, you know, all these ones in the background, they'll show up how they do. But because In Harmony is set in a small town with a pretty spread out neighborhood, it was important for me to at least have some of my characters own vehicles, hence why I have to draw all these cars. And so, since In Harmony is also set in 2022, I have a lot of different vehicle types I can pull from, and I think it's pretty realistic for me to have that. I work in an area where I have seen people drive anything from like the newest car that just came out all the way to like a Model T's, which are from like the 20s, 10s. They're old ass cars. So to keep my vehicles consistent, I do make refs for them. However, because I don't actively draw cars outside the comic, I don't have a ton of experience drawing them. So when I need to make a reference for a vehicle, I just find the vehicle I want, do a sketchy trace on top of that, and using the original image as a reference, do some refined line art on top of the trace sketch to neaten it up a little bit. I simplify details and stuff before I color it, and then it's finished. Tracing allows me to draw the car how it looks and draw accurately in comic, and I don't trace images of cars whether it's a panel where I need to do one, because I want to get good at drawing cars, so I rather just start drawing the car. But now that I have like references, I can keep my cars more consistent. And I can look up other images if I need to know what certain parts of the car look like to draw as accurately as I can. At least until I get good enough at Blender to be able to model cars myself, which, speaking of 3D models, that is another great tool for tracing. 3D models are amazing for speeding up the art process, allowing you to get your perspectives right, height comparisons, and other things you need to make your drawings look good. I use models in Harmony specifically for backgrounds. These pages in Chapter 3, for example, have very simple models I use to make perspective easier for the scene. I've slowly been getting better at using Blender and have been making more detailed models, but those are spoilers for future pages of the comic. If you guys haven't read Chapter 4 yet, you should keep an eye out. A more recent one I could show a solid example of is for my senior film We Ignored the Signs. I used Maya to model and animate some basic 3D shapes and rotoscoped on top of those to animate some complicated movements involving large mechanical objects, such as these drones, and my more complicated shot of the film, which was this pod leaving the spaceship and landing on Sapien. I made a whole video talking about my process and involvement using 3D objects in a 2D animation, so if you want more details about that specific process, you could go and watch that video. But 3D models are very great for when you have to draw something in proportion and when you need something to be the right height, perspective, and it can just save you a lot of time on things. Another thing it could be good for is with detailed objects, specifically if a character is interacting with said objects. Lackadaisy is probably the most recognizable example I can give that does this very well. If you follow them online, they'll occasionally share whips of shots and how they build up a scene, and some of those scenes show characters holding objects that were 3D modeled, and they just move around in the character's hands before they actually, touch them up to make them look into the style of the show. If in the newest trailer where they announced their partnership with Glitch, if you look, you can see some of the objects the characters are holding are 3D, although at the time of writing this, I don't know if they are 3D objects that were made to look 2D, or if they were 3D objects that were rotoscoped to be 2D. Which, if you don't know what rotoscoping is, it's basically just tracing on top of, something that is moving to animate on top of it. It's basically just like tracing animation. But it's usually done with like live action stuff, but you can also do it with 3D models. Woo! If you know what they did, you feel free to clarify it down below, because I'm very interested to see how they went about with it. Now, those ones use 3D models, and not everyone knows how to model. However, if your computer can run Blender, I recommend learning how to use it. I learn a little bit more every time I open it up and I work on something, and I think it's a great tool. Plus it's free, so it's like, You know, you're not paying for Blender, so you could just use it whenever you want. But if you can't use 3D models for some reason, then here's another way you can use stuff to help you out with your art better, and that is with photography. However, photography is a bit iffier because there's some photos that are art pieces themselves, and I would not recommend really tracing those. If you're gonna trace photos, then I would use stock images and such like that. They're really great for references sometimes because you could get like more poses out of it, and there's people who make accounts and websites specifically just for stock images to use as references. But if you're like, say, drawing a character holding a glass of wine and you can't really draw the glass of wine right, if you could find like a close enough image to what you're going for, you could just plop that picture in there and then just draw on top of it. I don't normally trace objects in my art. The only tracing in the comic was with 3D backgrounds I made, and occasionally I'll trace a pattern on a design if drawing it by hand isn't working out because it's way too complicated to do it by hand. But only rarely. I'll be working on a piece and have a reference of someone holding the thing I want to draw the character holding, and it still isn't right, then I'll find the image of the thing and I'll put it where I want it to be and to do a sketch on top of it. I still use my reference to get the pose right, but all the details of the object will be there, and they will be there and look, you know, like the character is holding it. And because I specifically look for stock images, I tend to feel better about doing it because they're not like, you know, a photographer who's trying to make a living out there. However, you're doing a large project or making money off of whatever you're doing, then I would suggest not doing this at all. I just only unless the images are public domain, but me personally, I would feel better not doing it unless I'm using my own photos. So that's just the me thing. It's, you know, it's whatever. It's mostly for me, it's like copyright thing. And also just like, it's like, how much of other people's stuff do I want to use in my own work, you know? So let's get to the hotter subtopic about tracing and talking about tracing art to learn how to draw in somewhat style. Because that's the one everybody knows. As I said earlier, I started learning how to draw by tracing, and even though those old drawings won't ever see the light of day, what they did do was help me get used to drawing things past what I would draw, you know, stick figures, like everybody else. However, now that I have 15 years of creating art under my belt, I don't need to trace to be able to draw, but I can trace to learn how to draw in a specific style. But why would I do this if I already know how to draw? Well, from an animation point of view, it's one of the easier ways to learn how to draw in an art style that isn't one you typically draw in. I did some work on the classmate's in-progress short film Magnet, and I had to trace some of the layouts he made whenever I was tasked with animating a shot or working on a color key. The style of the film is much more cartoony and simpler than my art style is, so I had to get used to working in simplified shapes, as well as referencing the notes my classmates made about the shape language of each of the characters. But this also works for wanting to learn how to draw in someone's art style. I mean, how many art challenges are there on YouTube of drawing myself in this cartoon show's art style? It's not bad, it's actually a really fun exercise, and I want to do it myself, but I haven't actually gotten around to doing that yet. But when I do, I'll be using this technique to get used to drawing in these styles before attacking the final pieces for that someday future video. I decided to pick 4 shows to do this exercise with. My favorite animated TV show, Infinity Train, Adventure Time, and Fiona and Cake, because my sister requested me to do the Adventure Time style, and I threw Fiona and Cake in there as well, and the Owl House. Now, I don't actually trace any of these drawings in these time lapses, but that is because I did that off recording, and instead of recording me redrawing these screenshots using the original image as a reference, because if I drew over them twice for the time lapse, it would look really weird, so I just did the reference version. Infinity Train style is the closest to my own of the 3, I think, but I found it the hardest one to mimic. The art is simple, but there's so much detail put into each design, even if they don't look it visually. But I started getting the hang of it with some of these characters, specifically like with some of the like Lake and Amelia ones. I love them both, they're my favorites. The perks of having Blorbos. But the Adventure Time of Fiona and Cakes were the easiest. The style is very simple and very noodly, and the characters are just very shaped, so it's very easy for me to get the hang of drawing them. The Owl House also has very shaped characters, like Ida's hair is very triangular, a lot of the characters have like circles in their designs, and the eyes were easiest for me to draw of all of them I mean, with the exception of Adventure Times, because Adventure Times is literally just dots. But I think it was easier in compared to like Infinity Trains because the style of the Owl House's eyes is closer to how I draw eyes. And I think all these came out great. Some are a bit more rough than others, but this was a quicker exercise for this point in the video, so I don't really mind. When I do a style video, I definitely will be doing more actual studies instead of just referencing some images to redraw them. So I will probably have like a lot more references of me getting used to drawing full bodies of the characters in the style. But like overall, like I think when it comes to like tracing art, as long as you're like being respectful about where you get it and how you're using it, and you're not like finding a cool drawing on the internet, tracing on top of it, and then being like, I drew this, I made this up, this is my thing. And I'm like, you should be good. Don't like, you know, I mean, it's not overcomplicated, just don't be an asshole. I think that's like a lot of these kind of things where people are like, I want art advice about not doing this thing that people says is sometimes okay to do. Just don't be an asshole about it. That's it. And that does it for today's video. This one is, you know, the typical controversial art topic on the internet. Woo! But like, I also remember when people were saying referencing art was, or referencing photos, or just like referencing anything, or even like creating custom brushes was considered cheating, which I think is stupid. And I'm aware that there's still people with those opinions, but like, that's like the kind of discourse that's just like, it's not that deep, guys. It really isn't. Tracing is a bit more complicated. As you can tell, this is an almost 20-minute video, but whatever. It's not black and white, so, you know, just, like, don't be an asshole. But let's get to the end. If you like what I do, consider sticking around. I do videos like these, and I do podcast recommendations and animations. I like making whatever I want and posting it when it's done. And if you like that too, then consider subscribing. Next month's video is going to be about In Harmony. It's going to be the comic's 2-year anniversary in December, and I want to do a video about the characters and some of the behind the scenes stuff, as well as talk about some of the things that I didn't make the cut when what I'm calling Season 1. Very excited for you guys to see that. But if you don't know what In Harmony is, it's my webcomic. It's currently in its 4th chapter, and people have been amped up to see what is going on with Joel. Go read it to see what happens to our favorite photographer and hope that they do not get eaten by whatever is out there. And finally, I have a Patreon. Patrons get early access to In Harmony pages, animation whips, as well as concept art for future projects. I just posted my first ever sketchbook tour, flipping through my very first sketchbook I drew In Harmony pages in, and talked about my process for making them. I want to do more Patreon exclusive videos in the future, so if that sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and consider becoming a member. Every bit helps me continue to make stuff just for all of you. That's it for today's video. See you all later. Bye!